Welcome, everyone. You are listening to a podcast of Alive Covenant Church. To learn more, visit us at kitsapalive.org. Today, our focus is on the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew was considered an outsider by the religious people of the day, not good enough for Jesus. But Matthew understood Jesus' teaching that healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. And so when Jesus invited, "Follow me and be my disciple," he started following and kept listening to Jesus. We're invited to do the same. Start following Jesus, keep listening, and take action on Jesus' words. May Jesus, the Messiah, keep forming us into the people of God, called to act and be a blessing to all the families on the earth. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who you already know, David Nelson. And I'm just excited to have him share with us this morning. It is always a wonderful gift when we get to hear from each other. And so looking forward to how God speaks through you to us.
Okay. The mic works. Across the first hurdle. Matthew's a runner, Alyssa's a runner, I used to be one, kind of still am. And the build up to your race is the worst, right? Your butterflies, everything. And then you hit that moment right before where all it kind of goes down to peace. So I just got there. If you would pray for me to stay there, it'd be nice. I grew up the son of a minister. My dad was a pastor. And I don't know if Justice and Greta and Ella and Kwame and Fia ever had to deal with this from people in this church. But the old churchmen at Bethany Covenant liked to come up to you as a little kid and say, "So, you gonna be a pastor when you grow up?" And I was really embarrassed by that. But now, I'm gonna go off my script for a second. I am actually grateful that my father never introduced my girlfriend on the screen. I was dealing with nothing, I forget. But I was going to play for the Mariners or draw comic books, so of course I wasn't going to be a pastor. And I didn't become one. And so when Darren asked me to talk this morning, that's why I insisted on what you see in your bulletin was called story and not a sermon. I'm not qualified to give a sermon, but I'm a journalist. That's my job. So I feel like I'm more qualified to tell stories. The sermons can be for my dad and for Darren and for the other trained professionals. You can put the picture up if you want. The passage that I was asked to share about is Matthew 4:12 through 25. And that story, which Kyle and Carrie read the first of it, the story is about beginning of Jesus' time preaching. He was fulfilling a prophecy by Isaiah and describes the times when crowds were gathered to be healed, where they witnessed miracles and hear good news, and then the calling of his disciples, which is in the picture here. And he walks to shore and asks them to come out of the boat. You can go to the next slide. At our house church, and I think everyone else's house church, we always we read the text, and then we ask each other, what jumps out at you? And so I did that to myself when I did this. And the part of the passage that jumps out to me are verses 18 to 22, and that's specifically when Jesus calls to Peter and Andrew, and then James and John to leave their father's boat and follow him. And I'm just going to read that part again. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing the nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father, and followed him. Now, like I said, I'd never expected to give a sermon before, and I really hadn't expected to sing a song in front of the church. So this is the difficult part of this. I need to get through this part. You might remember this one from Sunday school or Vacation Bible School if you were a kid who grew up in a covenant church, or maybe another one. And it's drawn from those words. And it's what pops into my head still as an adult when I hear this passage. And it goes, "I will make you fishers of men, fishers of men, fishers of men. I will make you fishers of men if you follow me. Thank you. So the start of my story, however, is that I really didn't like that song as a kid. And that's kind of a core memory for whatever reason. It stayed in my brain, but I didn't like it. The way I heard it wasn't an example of Jesus' presence speaking to the disciples or a blessing for each one of us. It felt like an assignment. And maybe because it said the words, I will make you, because I didn't want to be made to do something like that. I felt like I was being asked to evangelize to my friends, and kids don't want to do that. Or it meant I had to grow up and knock on the doors like the Mormons. Everyone, you got to go pitch everybody. And I didn't want to do that either. I knew it was someone else's job to tell everyone else about Jesus, and it was definitely my dad's job to tell everyone about Jesus. And I didn't want it to be mine. I didn't want that to be what I was made to do. And I got to tell you that some of that feeling came back when I read this verse again. I still don't think that I'm an evangelist. That's not what my gift is. That's not what I want it to be. When we started studying Matthew this spring, Darren had the Moore family come up and read through the lineage of Jesus that was at the beginning of the Gospels. And he told a story from his own family, and he encouraged us to look closely at our families, where we come from, why it matters, think about how our lives are going to influence the generations after us. There's a pastor that I really liked. His name was Jim Sunholm, and he died. Gordy knows who he is, but Bev does. And Jim didn't make up this phrase, but he would use it, and this is where I first heard it, and it's that we are always standing on someone else's shoulders, if you've ever heard that before. It's always been powerful, and I think that was at the core of what Darren was asking us to think about when he said things else after that sermon, and we had a really good discussion with a lot of people shared about their own families. And some of the examples were good, and some of the examples were bad. They were negative things that had happened. And I think that was good to do because no perfect people, like we say in Alive, it applies to our families as well. So I'm going to share one from my family with you. This is my grandma Jean and I, and it was taken at Easter years ago. Jean Berglund Nelson, she died in 2015 when she was 97 years old. But during the past 10 years of her life, I had regularly spent time with her. I'd moved back to Washington, and I started going to Seattle First Covenant Church for a while. I'd commute across the water. And so after church, I'd drive her home, not every week, but pretty commonly, and we'd have lunch. And when it was clear she was really aging, I decided to kind of be a journalist and start interviewing her and getting some of these stories out before she was gone. So as an adult, I heard a lot more detail about Jean's early life than I'd ever known. And after she died, more and more of those family stories started coming out, and we were talking about them. She was born in 1918 in Tacoma. She walked a lot around the city, and I remember my dad saying when she died that walking all those miles as a kid is probably what kept her alive so long, because after her mind had left, her body just kind of kept kicking and stayed alive in her hospice. Her family moved around a lot as a kid. They had small towns all over the Olympic Peninsula and then ended up back in Tacoma, and she graduated from Stadium High School. She told me these stories about moving around and bouncing around, but she didn't tell me why. And the answer was most likely that her family was very poor, and her dad was an alcoholic. He couldn't hold a job, and it's unlikely he was attentive to his kids at all. And he eventually left Jean and her mother, her 4 sisters, and a brother because he had secretly started another family on the other side of the state. And none of that was ever talked about with our grandmother, of course. You don't say that stuff. And I understand the reasons families don't talk about things that are negative or embarrassing, no matter how much they might shape your future. But I also think my grandmother didn't talk about it because, well, that decision of her father's changed her life. It didn't define her life. Like I said, she was poor, and that was probably exacerbated without the one breadwinner in the family. She was in her teens. She was in her late teens when this all was happening, and so she had to drop out of college after just a quarter. She wanted to be a teacher. She couldn't do what she wanted to do. The state people, because her mother had to be on welfare, and so the state aid said, you can't have a kid who's going into college if we're going to give you money to feed your family. So that was the reason. And after her mother died just a few years later, she had just got married to my grandfather Henning, and then they had to take in the teenage sisters. And so if you can imagine, you're 24 or 25, you just get married, and suddenly you have teenagers. That's not also what you designed for your life. Those are the kind of circumstances that could have left our family in a cycle of poverty. I think that happens often. Could have made Jean very bitter or angry, could have left her regrets that lasted her whole life. And maybe some of those feelings existed, but none of us knew. It wasn't something she shared. One thing I do know is that my father and my uncle never met their grandfather, even though he moved back within a mile or so of their house when he was later in his life. My grandmother made that decision. It was probably a difficult choice. And you could even say it's too harsh of her to not let her boys meet their grandfather. But she declined to pursue any sort of family reunion, and I don't know if she ever reached a place of forgiveness. But her life story is ultimately about how God blessed it by changing the path. She met my grandfather in Tacoma, and rather than becoming a teacher, she got a job with Social Security, which was brand new at the time. She helped people get their benefits when they were learning about that. She ended up a secretary. She worked in the federal government. She ended up eventually at Sandpoint Naval Station over in Seattle, and she was the secretary to this high-up Navy commandant. Because of all that federal work, she had a gold-plated health care up until the day she died, which was kind of a benefit of that time in our country, I think. She had 2 sons who went far beyond their parents' level of education. She had successful grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She went to the same church for 72 years. She loved being on committees and the detail, which a lot of us think is boring. That's where she excelled. And she was involved when women became more prominently involved in the Covenant Church. She was a part of that. And she was a stickler about being on time. You never started late with Jean Nelson. And that trickles down to our family even now. There are people who are bothered when a family holiday doesn't get going at the time it's supposed to get going. She died without any money because they made a few real estate decisions with my grandfather that were probably short-sighted. But she never complained about it, even in her late years. She was not a grumpy person, never was bitter. She lived in a beautiful Covenant retirement home. After her husband died and she was cared for, she transitioned into assisted living and eventually hospice. She overcame a lot of obstacles, but had a good life and a blessed life, and I'm better because of it. You can change it. To go back to that Bible story, one detail that I can notice without being a pastor or any theological training is that these guys were fishermen. And I think that's a blue-collar job. There's long hours and long days, and when you're unsuccessful sometimes, it's a grind, or persistence is more important than persuasion. And I think persuasion is the thing that I heard you needing to get new believers. Maybe the difficulty of that fishing work made it easier for James and John to walk away from their father's boat when they were called. But maybe that's part of what made them good at the next thing they were going to do. When I reacted to that song from Children's Church, feeling called to do something that would make me uncomfortable or something that I'd fail at, I wasn't hearing the task described at what a fisherman actually does. It sounded more like I had to go do the miracle of healing people than just pull up the nets or go back on the boat over and over again. I think my grandmother's story wasn't inspiring to us as grandsons on its face. We weren't impressed by that because she didn't have this personality that left us touched in a very profound way. Her life and my grandfather, her husband, they're very quiet, everyday people. They showed up on time. They went to their kind of blue-collar, middle-class jobs. And it describes a lot of us in here. But looking at what she persisted through shows me a way that we are called to faith. Some people have described that as finding the sacred in the profane, not in the sense of foul language, but in the non-religious parts of your life, the boring, the everyday, the basic. And I think that's been a lesson for me in recognizing how that kind of life is actually fishing for men, like is in the Bible verse. And then I thought about Jesus' metaphor in a different way. When my dad would preach in the 90s, he liked to make references to The Simpsons, which was a new show at the time. And it was kind of edgy at the time, which is so funny to think of in today's day and age, that Homer going to a bar or Bart mouthing off could be questioned. And I think some of those old church guys raised an eyebrow at him when he did it. I'm going to blow way past him right now if you go to the next slide. This photo, if you recognize it, you're laughing, so I think you recognize it. This is from a movie in the 90s called Pulp Fiction. And for the kids, don't ask your parents for this one on movie night. This character, Samuel L. Jackson, plays Jules Winfield, and Jules is a gang hitman who uses a Bible verse as a weapon. And just to clarify, it's not a real Bible verse, it's kind of made up if you know the movie. Jules is a hitman, and he quotes Ezekiel when he's doing his job, and he recites a line about how a shepherd is needed to protect a flock from evil men, and then the gun is the shepherd, and then he blows somebody's head off. Later in the movie, his own life is spared in what he interprets as a miracle of God. So there is a little redeeming thing here. And he has this epiphany. He tells his partner, Vincent Vega, that he's resigning from the gang, and he's going to walk the earth, and he's going to wait till God puts him where he's supposed to be. Seconds later, after he tells him this, he's faced with an opportunity to shoot another guy, and he's an evil man trying to rob him. And Jules looks at the guy with a gun in his face, and he says, "It's more likely we are the sheep. We are the weak ones in need of the protection. And maybe he's a shepherd rather than an enforcer dealing out the punishment, and he spares the man's life." Now, I'm twisting the logic a little bit in that scene because it's not exactly pairs with the text, but the reason I thought of Jules is because of how he flips it around and looks at Scripture from a different side. That was what occurred to me. And what I thought of in the Matthew verse is the verse, and I can say this in Samuel L. Jackson's voice, but what if I'm the fish instead of the fisherman? You can go back to the next one. We read about Jesus calling the disciples, and I think it's really common to translate that to me directly. To whatever it says there, that's what I'm supposed to do. The story of disciples means I'm being called, and I have to follow that example. I'm being asked to go fishing for men, even to the extent of the illustrations walking away from my job or my family to do it. Well, I think it's true that we can apply Bible stories to our own lives, looking at it the other way. When I'm the fish, I'm the man needing a fisherman or a shepherd to look after me. Then the verse is offering reassurance rather than reassignment. What I mean is that Jesus has called many to follow him and be those disciples, a lot of you in here, because my life needed what you can offer me. I've been nudged many, many times in my life towards following the right direction. I've needed that. It's often really slight. Sometimes it doesn't work right away, but it's always been consistent. It's something I really value, and I also don't think it's any accident. And 99% of the time, all of those little actions aren't what I would call proselytizing or evangelizing or being a fisher of men. They're very small. They're everyday things. It was mentors or leaders when I was a kid. It was making new friends in college. It was meeting coworkers in non-Christian environments and adult friends, other parents, a lot of people in this room too. It provided an example or were a listener or made an invite to me or held me accountable. You've been doing that for me for 10 years here that I've been going to Alive, whether you know it or not. And I now see all of you as fishers of me and fishers of men and women in the rest of your lives too, following the path set out when Jesus called his disciples. The message Jesus gave to the disciples in Matthew is less intimidating to me when I frame it that way, knowing that I can be on both sides of the story. It helps me accept the assignment that's offered, and like Jules, being open to the opportunities that might come next in my life. Jesus' call to become a disciple becomes a more realistic part of my daily routine, something I can find a way to build on as each new week starts. Thanks for listening. Amen.